Good to see you this morning. I know several have been out of town, as have we. It's good to be home. It's good to see you back as well. But I think we still have some folks traveling because of the holidays. When we left off on Sunday in this lesson, one of the last things that was said about Solomon, in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23, it says, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, and horses and mules. That's right where we left off. Solomon had everything. God had given him wisdom. He had used it in good ways. We see that in the early part of his kingdom for sure. He had made some good decisions. People came to him just to hear Solomon talk, just to hear him speak, to hear what wisdom he might have to impart. And it seems like in so many ways everything's going well. The kingdom was in a good position, in a good place, that there was great allegiance to God. But not everybody. There were those who worshiped and followed other gods. But now the question is, when we just focus on Solomon here for a minute, how could a man who praised God and did so much to honor and glorify God turn away from him? I mean, what do you think? What happened? Well, we haven't got there yet, but we are in this lesson. What happened to Solomon? His choice of wives. Here's a big influence on what happens.
I think it's a mix of two things. He might have gotten a little bit prideful in his own wisdom, perhaps. And secondly, whenever you have everything, it's easy to forget where it came from.
Very true. And, there were several influences. Even he himself became an influence, maybe for some things not good. Maybe he did become prideful. Or maybe it became just easy to look to himself, for ideas or thoughts or direction because he had everything. He had been proven to have wisdom. Maybe he thought too well of himself. But we know this much for sure. There were some influences that he was having to face and deal with that would be huge. That would just really be big. And that is his wives. His wives. Chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Remember, Pharaoh's daughter was his first wife, okay? Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not marry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Remember, God was specific about that. Think back to the days of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 7. God was specific. Do not marry foreign wives because they will draw you away. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Here's the change. God tells us what happened to Solomon. God tells us what the influence was. It was these wives, these foreign wives. God had forbid Israel to marry them. Solomon did it anyway. And it was their gods. All of these nations around served pagan gods. And Solomon fell for that. Verse 5 says that Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. Now, what would you say about that? What are just the thoughts that come to mind?
Even with Solomon's great faith, he had a side of weakness, and weakness is where temptation comes in.
Weakness is where temptation comes in. His weakness was with these wives. That was a problem. That was a weakness. And here's where the evil came in. Okay? What are the thoughts? Wayne.
I think a significant lesson out of it is just in a few words. Those people that we associate with, customarily, if you will influence our lives.
Yeah. Those that we associate with will influence our lives. We all get that. We all know that. And yet, why do we resist that advice? When God says evil companions corrupt good morals, why do we argue about that? I mean, do we realize that we're arguing with God when we say, well, that's not going to happen to me? Or they are not going to have an influence on me? Do we understand that we are arguing with God? That is never a good position to be in, right? And so we see so very clearly here the influence that these others had on Solomon. And it's just hard for me to imagine. What Solomon winds up doing is there are going to be temples to these gods in Israel. And Solomon is going to be a part of that. Reading a little farther here, verse 7. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Really? I mean, Solomon is the one who just built this temple for Jehovah God. We spent a lot of time talking about that. The years of planning that David had put in place and preparing. And the instructions from God that Solomon followed explicitly and built it just as God had said. And now he's building these temples for foreign gods. What is going on, Joe? You know, you hate to even bring this one up, but I mean, all of these gods are evil. But Molech is the one that just stands out in my mind in the most incredible way. You know, an idol built in such a way where there is a fire that is placed in the belly of Molech, and they would drop babies into that fire. They would offer infants to their god. And so we think about where Solomon was in a relationship with Jehovah God and where he has moved now, and it's like, how in the world can that happen? How can he move so far?
One more thing, 300 wives over lust, not wisdom, it's planted wisdom, lust. It's a lot of women.
Yes.
They don't even name them.
This is hard to even try to figure out and conceive. 700 wives, 300 concubines. Wives, there is a marriage that takes place there, and they are legally his wife. Concubines are like mistresses. They don't have the same rights as the wives do. But 1,000 women. I mean, I can't even conceive. You know, what is he thinking? And I don't know. I mean, where he's gone from here to here is just beyond thinking.
Which I think is a good thing, especially with our older classes, to bring up, because they don't yet, but we, older people, all of us have people that have left the truth because of further study.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, what was he thinking? I mean, people you can't believe, but the minute that we leave God's word, and the minute we leave, you know, I know it was his wife, but he left. That takes up time, and he left the time he needed to stay with God. And this further study kind of thing, any of us can fall, and I think that's what we need to point out is any of us can let the devil get in our mind.
Any of us can fall. To those of you who are teaching in the youth classes next quarter, I'm just thinking that there's some points of emphasis here. That this lesson about Solomon, what happened to him, deserves some emphasis. And even with the smaller kids, there are points that can be understood. like our friends, other influences around us make a difference? You know, for sure we can talk about that, and we can make some points about that. And with those that are a little bit older, those whom we choose to marry, God looks at marriage in this singular sense. You know, what Solomon has done is just far outside of what God would have us do. But to talk about the influence of who we marry is so important. And how many have we that have been drawn away from the Lord because of the influence of a spouse? It's like with Solomon, like what chance has he got here? You know, with all of these wives who served foreign gods, the influence that was upon him was just overwhelming, you know, to say the least. So Solomon's attitude toward God changed. And then it becomes just quite obvious and evident here. Well, God's attitude toward Solomon changes. Verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Just that's almost like a side point that's thrown in here. You know, it's like, what have these other gods done? I mean, where is the power of these other gods that Solomon now is giving allegiance to? As compared to Jehovah God, who has come to Solomon twice and speaks to him again now? You know, I think it's just an interesting point that's made there in verse 10. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Very plain and very simple. Here's what happened. Here's what went wrong. Here is the problem. And so as Solomon's attitude toward God changed, God's attitude toward Solomon changes. God had blessed Solomon in such incredible ways. God told Solomon that, in these verses coming up, God tells Solomon, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you. You know, it was only because of respect for David that God was going to wait until Solomon died. And I'm thinking that's quite generous. You know, that even he would do that. I'm thinking that if I was Solomon at this point, I'd be looking out for a lightning bolt. You know, that's lightning is going to strike from heaven. Because Solomon surely can understand and knows that he has stepped far, far away from the will of God. Okay, verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. What do you think about God's position here? How God's attitude towards Solomon? And what do you think about the way God's dealing with this? What he just told Solomon here. What are your thoughts about that? But there is still some level of patience from God. There was not the lightning bolt. Okay? God is direct in what he says. But who is God still remembering here? David. He's still remembering David and the promises made to David. Well, what else would you think of here? Just God's attitude towards Solomon. Anything else? Please.
Very gracious and giving patience to Solomon, and very honorable to his covenant with David.
God remembers his covenant to David. It seems like Solomon is not remembering that so well right now, but God is remembering that covenant. God is not the one who broke the covenant, but God is still the one who remembers that. Wayne?
I think it also shows I'm going to call it a continuation of God's plan for David and David's family and the coming of Jesus.
Okay. There's a bigger picture in all of this. And God remembers that plan. So God is going to make sure that there is a way where this lineage through David continues. All right, other thoughts? All right. Well, let's see. Solomon broke every warning given by God. You know, if you think back to Deuteronomy 17, we're not going to turn there right now, but part of the instruction that God gave through Moses was to Israel, when you have a king, because they'd already been crying for a king, when you have a king, what this king should do is that he should write a scroll of all of the words of the law, the books of the law. The king should write that, and he should have it, and he should read that. What's the important part lesson that comes out of that? What's that? Stay with God's word. You suppose David is reading from that scroll every day right now? I'm just thinking not. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know that. But I'm having a hard time thinking that Solomon would be serving these other gods, these idols, these foreign gods, while reading from the scroll the words of the law every day. You know, the law where God is saying, have no other God beside me. Have no idols. Remember that part? I'm just thinking that Solomon is not, perusing through the law every day. The lesson for us, the lesson for our kids. What's our point? Stay in the Word. There will be influences in life that we can't run from every day. There'll be influences around us all the time, every day. But we better overcome those influences with consideration of what God says and being in His Word. Because if we're not doing that, those influences, they'll win. It's what happened to Solomon. And we can't say that it doesn't happen. We can't say it doesn't happen that way. We're reading about how it happened just that way. Powerful lessons here in this chapter. Powerful lessons.
Just a side note thing. I love the wording of verse 6. And Solomon did evil inside the Lord and went not fully after the Lord. He didn't turn from God completely. He didn't just give his full devotion to God. And we need to remember to give God our due diligence and honor, make sure that we're fully going after God. Because to me, it's more offensive to kind of just cast God aside like a half-hearted attempt to follow him than it is to do him fully.
There is this point that Solomon did not completely forget about Jehovah God. He just added in all of these other gods around Jehovah God. God never accepts that kind of worship. Never. Never does God accept that kind of worship. So let's look here. There's some consequences now. There are some things that happen because of Solomon's action. Because Solomon's turned from the Lord. Verses 14 through 40, basically, start dealing with some of these ideas. We're not going to read all of that, but the Lord raised up enemies against Solomon. Solomon hasn't really had to deal with that too much. In his kingship, remember, David had fought the battles. He had the wars and conquered land. Well, Solomon was able to amass more land as well, but we don't see Solomon out there in battles. He didn't have enemies that were overtaking him. But now there are some enemies that are coming in. He had enjoyed a reign that just did not have a lot of those problems and struggles. But because of his disobedience, some things are changing. In verses 14 and following, Hadad, who was a descendant from Edom. Remember Edom? Israel had to deal with Edom a long time ago. It was one of their enemies. This Hadad was of royal lineage. He had fled to Egypt after some of the battles long before. But now he returns to Israel. He comes to be a thorn in the side of Solomon. He's causing havoc in the kingdom. There's Rezon. He was a rebel in northern Israel. Hadad was from the south. Now from the north, Rezon, he gathered forces up and he establishes some headquarters in Damascus. You know, that's not so far out. When I think about northern Israel, I'm thinking like way on up. You know, Damascus is up there, but you know what? He's moving in. He's moving into Israel. Then there's Jeroboam. Jeroboam's not from the outside. Jeroboam is from the inside. He's one of Solomon's officials, one that Solomon's had confidence and trust in. So the prophet Ahijah comes to Jeroboam, appears to him, and has a message for him. So we start taking up in verse 26. We need to read about this just a little bit. Chapter 11, verse 26. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zariah. Here's an account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force in the house of Joseph. So for reasons not explained, Solomon is kind of building up, fortifying the walls around the city of Jerusalem. And Jeroboam is called the eye of the king because he does his work well. And now he's put in charge of the workforce. Verse 29. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." It's a very descriptive story. We can see what's happening, what's unfolding. We're introduced to Jeroboam. We understand his place and his position in the kingdom of Solomon, that he has some authority. He has some ability to do and to get things done. Then Ahijah the prophet comes in. Now, what would you think if you were Jeroboam? I mean, what's going through the mind of Jeroboam when this prophet comes to him? What would you say? What would you think about that?
I think it must be what God wants.
You know, if this is a prophet of God that comes, Jeroboam must be thinking this is what God wants, at the same time thinking, why? And why me? Well, it's made clear it's because Solomon has left Jehovah. Solomon's got all these other gods now around him. But still, wouldn't that be an odd position to be in? And now to be told that you're going to have 10 tribes, there are going to be 2 that are left for Solomon or for his descendants is all there's going to be. And there's 2. There's 12 pieces torn. 10 and 2. And yet it says there's going to be 1 tribe for the descendants here of Judah. How do we get to 1? What happened to there being 2 tribes? Well, why does it say 1? Yeah, because the tribe of it is very small. Judah is the larger tribe. And the southern kingdom is going to be known as Judah. It's not because Benjamin's not there. It's just because it was a smaller tribe. And it'll just be known as Judah.
Interesting application of ancient all night. You remember when Solomon approached Hiram, he said, "I want you to help me build my temple." At that time, Solomon said, "I have no
love this point. What has changed here? God hasn't changed. God is not the one who changed. It is Solomon who changed and who moved away from God. That's the issue. God's going to work his plan. God has always said what would happen. If they leave, if they move away, if you walk away from me. So, the reason given here, the prophet told Jeroboam that God was going to make him king over 10 tribes. That had to be kind of a heady thing. Like, how is this and why me? But Ahijah gave Jeroboam the reasons why that was happening. God is still holding to his promise that he's not going to take the whole kingdom away from the house of David. But it's greatly changed. And when Solomon heard this, when we read a little bit farther here, this last part, let's see, verse 34, but I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose and who observed my commands and my statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to a son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Interesting here, God's promise to Jeroboam, I'll bless you. Your kingdom will flourish. Remember, these 10 tribes in north, these are still God's people. God is not wishing ill of them. He wants to bless them. And he promises that to Jeroboam, if you keep my will and my commandments. That part's not going to go so good, but that's in the story to come. But what Solomon does here is surprising and not. Verse 40, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt to Shishak the king and stayed there until Solomon's death. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. What does that sound like? What's that remind us of? Saul trying to kill David, who was God's anointed. Yeah, that didn't work so well. Other thoughts? What happened to Solomon's wisdom? How would you answer that? God blessed Solomon with wisdom. What happened to that? Thing?
It's a free will thing. God gave Solomon wisdom, but that doesn't mean that God was just taking over control and, using Solomon as a puppet. Solomon had that wisdom so long as he used it for God's ends. And as soon as Solomon decided that he was going to go and make his own choices and do his own things, that's when God's wisdom left him.
I think we find an argument here for free will. God never took free will away from Solomon. Solomon was willing to follow and serve God. And with that, God blessed Solomon. Remember, it was Solomon who humbly went before God and prayed and asked for wisdom. Asked for wisdom for what purpose? To rule his people, to rule his kingdom, to be able to make good judgments. This was the humble Solomon. This was the Solomon that was petitioning God. I know how great your people are. What a great kingdom this is. And Solomon was young, remember? How am I supposed to do this? I'm inexperienced. I'm inexperienced. I'm unprepared. And he was asking God to bless him, to give him wisdom. God did that. God gave Solomon just what he needed. And for the first 20 years, when we read the storyline about Solomon, he was concerned about God. He was worshiping God. He was serving God. Remember, it was just a couple of chapters ago. We're talking about the dedication of the temple and the service and the praise that was going on there. Solomon's speech, Solomon's prayer. Remember Solomon's prayer? How incredible was Solomon's prayer to God and for the people? That's 20 years ago now. And somewhere along the line in that second 20 years of his reign, Solomon changed. And now the decisions he is making does not account for the wisdom that God had given him. See, there's just a lot of powerful stories that come out of this. Stories that are important for us to hear and to listen to.
He applied his wisdom and used his wisdom in the kingdom, but as far as his personal choices, he did not use the wisdom that he had.
So he was using that wisdom in leading the kingdom, and we see the result of that. Because we see that wisdom in his own life at that point in time. But now, as the king changes, and as the king turns from Jehovah God, what happens to the nation? Follows. You know, there are many now who are caught up with the worship of these other gods. And as we read forward in the storyline, things are not going to be so well with Israel or with Judah as the divided kingdom is about to come about. It's so sad that Solomon, in all of his wisdom, changed and he turned away from God. You know, Solomon had made an experiment of life. He tested and he tried everything. And in so many ways, he became an expert in life. But you know, you have to wonder and think a little bit, you know, the old phrase, don't get above your raisin. Solomon did. Solomon got too big for himself. He became too wise and thought too well of his own judgment and his own thoughts, and he stopped thinking about what God would have him do. There's a lot of his discoveries about life, as the text would say in the latter part of the chapter, are written in the Annals of Solomon. I'm not exactly sure what that is, unless we attribute that to Ecclesiastes, and there is perhaps some reason to do that. But Solomon, remember, Solomon wrote so many proverbs, and you know, it wrote many of his points of wisdom in his test of life. But by this time, you know, we're still talking about a kingdom that is the United Kingdom, as we've talked about. You know, as we've gone through all of these different Bible periods, we've worked our way through now the United Kingdom with Saul and David and Solomon as kings. But we're about to come into a period of time where the kingdom divides. That's where the storyline goes next. The divided kingdom, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. But before we get into that part of the storyline, we're taking a little break here for the next several classes as we give some consideration to some of the books of wisdom. Okay, so I want you to look at the schedule real careful here the next few weeks, because it's been pretty easy at this point. We're kind of going chapter by chapter in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, following that parallel storyline. We're taking a little break from that right now, because there are some other books of wisdom, as we might call them, that maybe give us some insight into a period of time. So Wednesday night, the plan will be to just talk a little bit about what are these books of wisdom. And we'll probably start into the book of Job on Wednesday night. Now, the book of Job, we're only spending 1.5 class periods on that. These are overview periods, okay? So no, we're not reading 40 chapters of Job, but we're just trying to take some highlights out of that, as well as some other books, the Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, And so that's how we're going to finish up this quarter, is spending a little bit of time looking at these books of wisdom. And then come the first quarter in January, we'll go back to the storyline. We're going to be taking up right here in the next couple of chapters where we see what happens and how the kingdom divides. It's a very sad time, really, but some powerful stories, lessons that'll come out of those stories. So that's our plan Wednesday night. Thank you for being here this morning. I appreciate so much your participation. Let's get ready for our worship.